Welcome to Luke21 Radio, a broadcast explaining biblical prophecy in the tradition of St. Augustine. And now, from Greenville, South Carolina, here's your host, Steve Wood.
Hello, this is Steve Wood, and welcome to Luke21 as we study biblical prophecy together. And again, this episode, we're in Revelation chapter 13. I'm calling this episode The All-Compelling End Times Deception. And Revelation 13 describes the end-time, demonically empowered, worldwide deception, first of the Antichrist, and that's the first half of chapter 13, verses 1 through 10, and then the end times deception of the false prophet, and that's chapter 13, starting in verse 11 to the end of the chapter. Now, one of the biggest things you have to understand when you study biblical prophecy, particularly in the book of Revelation, yes, biblical prophecy in the New Testament has a first century fulfillment, but the first century isn't the final fulfillment. And in the first century, a precursor of the worship of the Antichrist, which is described in Revelation 13, would have been the worship of Caesar. Caesar proclaimed himself God, and all the little cities and big cities throughout the Roman Empire were worshiping Caesar as divine. So that's a fulfillment, but it's not the final fulfillment, because what is described in Revelation 13, in the words of a couple of very keen commentators, is that the details here far exceed anything that happened in the first century. So the end times deception will be an intensified synthesis of all of the evil empires, wicked empires throughout human history, all of their rulers coupled together, along with a satanically inspired religious system. So this is what we're looking at as we approach Revelation chapter 13. And let's start with verse 3. One of its heads, the beast heads, seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth followed the beast with wonder. And last time I gave you a hint when looking at the beast, the Antichrist. He doesn't really come as a beast, particularly the first half of his 7-year reign. It's more like a pseudo-Jesus. So what was the outstanding miracle that Jesus performed? I mean, his incarnation, but in many ways that was hidden from the world because they were wondering, exactly who he was, where he came from, who his parents were, where did he get his religious insights. But particularly Jesus' resurrection following his crucifixion and death is the sign, because you can resuscitate someone, but you can't bring someone back after they've been dead for 3 days. And that's exactly what happened with Jesus. So that was the outstanding miracle. The Antichrist being a pseudo-Christ, what goes on? Well, it said in verse 3, he had a head that seemed to have a mortal wound, but it was healed, and the result was the whole earth followed the beast with wonder. In other words, this deception, this end times deception, will work. It will capture the attention of the entire world. Now, in the second half of Revelation 13, we have what's called the false prophet. You might call him a religious PR man for the Antichrist. He promotes the worship of the Antichrist, and he also uses false signs, deception, in order to lead people away from God. And this is what it says of him in Revelation 13, verse 11. Then I saw another beast which rose out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. In other words, he was a wolf in sheep's clothing. He looked very nice and religious. He might have, you never know, the false prophet might even have a clerical collar. Oh, he has to be good. No, pay attention because there are end-time deceptions. And what does he do? In verse 13 of Revelation 13, that's the false prophet, works great signs. And that word great in Greek, I always like to explain it. It's the word mega, which means the same thing in English. It's a mega sign, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in the sight of man. And verse 14, by the signs which it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on earth, bidding them to make an image for the beast, which was wounded by the sword and yet lived. Now, pulling these two together, if your primary, and I emphasize primary, if your primary means of spiritual discernment, particularly of the end times events, especially about the Antichrist and the false prophet, depends on signs, wonders, and miracles, how are you going to determine who the false prophet is? How are you going to determine the Antichrist is? Because they're pseudo-Christ, they're pseudo-prophets, they're pseudo-religious leaders, and they do great signs and miracles. And the false prophet is able to bring fire from heaven down to earth in the sight of men. Let's just say it was covered worldwide by cable news. If the false prophet, now hang with me here, this is going to be hard to take, but if the false prophet was able to work a celestial miracle as great as the miracle of the sun at Fatima, how many millions of Catholics do you suppose would end up worshiping the beast? If your primary means of discernment of end times events, and especially the Antichrist and the false prophet, is signs and wonders, what's going to keep people from falling for it? Let me take you a step further. While we're stepping on toes today, let's talk about Fox News. I've often wondered, will Fox News not only report on the great miracle, but would it support the false prophet? Would conservative Christians following Fox News, if they chose to say, hey, this is a great guy, he's a lamb, he looks like a lamb, but he isn't a lamb, he's a wolf, and he does great things, bringing fire from heaven to earth. Well, the great prophet Elijah did that in the Old Testament. This is exactly what we're saying. We're seeing a great prophet, and why not follow him? Will conservative Christians by the millions follow him? So, you might be tempted to think, I'm okay. I'm not going to be caught, so to speak, in the snare of deception by either the Antichrist or the false prophet. I can see my way through these things. And all I can say to you is, really? Listen to Revelation 13 and verse 8. And all, think about that word, all who dwell on earth will worship it. Everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb that was slain. Now, whether you know it or not, this is a very complicated verse because it deals with predestination and foreknowledge. And I can't do this in 15 minutes. I couldn't do it in 15 hours. So I'll just say this. Revelation 13:8, all who dwell on earth are going to worship him except those whose names are written in the book of life. In other words, they're leaning very heavy on the work of God in their lives. Yes, there's the human will and the free response to that, but God is going to be involved in this, and those who need to depend on God at this point will really need to do that. Jesus follows up with exactly what St. John said in Revelation 13, as recorded by Matthew in chapter 24 and verse 24. For false Christ and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. The elect are those written in the Lamb's Book of Life in Revelation 13:8. And basically, this is saying, this is getting right to the edge. This is going to be powerful. And the whole world, apart from a firm adherence to Christ, are going to fall for this. And then there's 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, starting in verse 9. And these verses are not in the lectionary of the Catholic churches in the United States. It says, the coming of the lawless one by the activity of Satan will be with all power and pretended signs and wonder, and with all wicked deception for those who are perish. And God is going to send upon them a strong delusion to make them believe what is false. So I can't get you any stronger warnings than what I gave you from Revelation 13, from Jesus' lips in Matthew 24:24, and St. Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2. These are the sternest warnings, and to think casually, I can handle this. So let me give you the practical way to keep from falling for false signs and wonders, because in our age, we're not accustomed to great miracles, signs, and wonders. When one happens, well, we'll fall for it unless we're prepared. And the way you prepare yourself is what I call the prophecy train. And there's a certain order and priority. If you follow it, you will have the means necessary to discern false signs, wonders, and even apparitions. And the prophecy train, starting with the engine, is sacred scripture, and combined with sacred scripture and the engine is the coal car. The two go together because they fuel each other. And then following scripture and sacred tradition, you would have, and I would suggest in today's world, the Catechism of the Catholic Church. And that is a good summary of the church fathers, the church doctors, and the church councils. But people are going to be changing the Catechism of the Catholic Church, is my expectation. So stick with John Paul II's version of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So you have your train, your engine, your coal car, and then you have the Catechism, church fathers, church doctors, church councils, but basically summarizing your John Paul II version of the Catechism. And then finally, not primarily, finally, you have the caboose. You don't discount these things, but the caboose contains signs, wonders, private revelations, and apparitions. And if you keep the primary, and the secondary, you will be fine. But what's going to happen during the Great Deception to those who have a train that goes backwards? Because many Catholics that I know start with the caboose, and their train goes backwards. It's not that they discount papal teachings, the catechism, or scripture, but they try to jam all these into the signs and wonders and apparitions and private revelation. And that's the exact opposite of what you need to be doing, because unless you have objective truth to lead you through the greatest deception the world will ever encounter, you're likely to fall for it. So stay away from the backwards prophecy train. Keep it going in the right direction, and you won't be deceived by the Antichrist and the false prophet. I'm Steve Wood, your host, and you've been listening to Biblical Prophecy with Luke21.
Luke21 is a radio outreach of Family Life Center International. To learn more about biblical prophecy, visit us online at Luke21.com.